A very important time in Irish history. The last 100 years or so have been very, very tense in Ireland, and it's been kind of a back and forth. But it really kind of starts in 1913, because in 1913 there's a political party in Ireland called Fine Gael. And Fine Gael had been asking the British government for what is called Home Rule. Now, Home Rule essentially meant that we would have our own government, we could have our own laws, collect our own taxes, but we would remain part of the British Empire and loyal to the Crown of England. The British government wasn't too keen on the idea in 1913. They'd lost quite a lot of the British Empire up at this point, and they were always terrified that Ireland would be used as a staging ground for another nation to invade Britain. Throughout history, this includes Spain and France, and we have a series of stone towers the whole way around the coast of Ireland, and these were used to essentially they put bonfires on top of them, and if they ever saw French or Spanish ships off the coast of Ireland, they would light them. They would light the whole way around to the east coast of Ireland, where Wales would be able to see it, and they could inform Britain that there was a potential invasion of Ireland taking place. So Britain was always absolutely terrified of this happening. It's why they wanted to hold on to Ireland for so long. Now in 1914, when the First World War broke out, or as we used to refer to it, the Great War, Britain was kind of worried about what could happen on the continent, and they wanted as many troops as they could possibly get. Now they knew enforcing conscription in Ireland would be a big bad idea, that it just would end very poorly for them. So they made a deal with Fine Gael. What they said was, if Ireland sends over loads of volunteers to fight the war on the continent, that they would in fact ensure that Home Rule would go into effect by the end of 1915. Ireland agreed to it, and hundreds of thousands of men signed up and head off to the continent. Now keep in mind, everybody believed that this war would come to an end by, before Christmas, that it would last no more than 6 months. But as we know, it went on for much longer than that. It went on for 4 long years. 2 years into the war, things weren't looking good. Britain looked like it could actually lose the war. There was no sight of an end of the war, but it was beginning to look like Britain might lose. Ireland was beginning to panic at this, because if Britain lost and Germany took over Britain, there was no way that Ireland was going to be left to do its own thing. Germany would then come over and take Ireland, and this was very well believed. So a new organisation leading up to this point is formed, and they are called the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Now the IRB had numerous leaders around the country, but the two most prominent men involved in it were Eamon de Valera and Michael Collins. Michael Collins was the military leader of it, and de Valera was the political head. He was very good at giving speeches and getting people all fired up. So they decide to orchestrate a rebellion against Britain. Now we've had hundreds of rebellions throughout Irish history, some successful, some not so much, but never actually gaining independence. And this one, they believe, will be the final rebellion. They think that they will be hugely successful during this. Plans and preparations for the rebellion are going quite smoothly, up until about a week before the rising is to take place. Before this, the rebels had sent a ship to Germany to buy weapons from the German army, called the Asgard. It had picked up the weapons and was on its way back to Ireland. But about a day and a half sailing outside of its port, in Dublin, on the west coast of Ireland, they were caught by a British naval vessel. Now the crew on board realised that they could either get caught and have the weapons discovered, meaning that the rising would be discovered by the British military, or they could sink the ship. And that's exactly what they did. They figured the best thing to do was sink the ship, lose the weapons, and at least the rising won't be discovered. So, not great. A lot of the weapons they wanted, gone. Now there were weapons in Ireland, but not to the same calibre, quality or number as what they were going to have from Germany. The day before the rising is to take place, so the day before Easter Sunday, an article is published into the newspapers in Ireland. And this article basically says Anybody who is to partake in marches, inverted commas, on Easter Sunday should stand down as they are being cancelled. A huge number of rebel leaders had decided at the last minute that this was probably a bad idea. They didn't have the weapons that they wanted, and they believed that Britain would respond very harshly to, a rebellion. Understandably, Britain was in the middle of a war on the continent. The last thing they wanted was for Ireland to turn around and fight back. Nonetheless, Easter Sunday comes along. Of the 30,000 rebels they expected to show up, only 6,000 showed up. So they're now low on guns and they're low on rebels to fight. But they go ahead with the rising anyway. The Irish Declaration of Independence is read out on O'Connell Street, and the first shots of the 1916 Rising are fired. Now in Dublin City there were two very important locations which needed to be taken. These were the GPO, the General Post Office on O'Connell Street, and Dublin Castle. The reason they had to take these two locations was they were the only places in Ireland that had telecommunication with Britain. Now, taking the GPO was no problem whatsoever. The day in question, there were only 2 security guards, each armed with a single 6-round revolver. So they took the GPO, no problem, and they set up their headquarters in the GPO because it's right in the city centre. Dublin Castle, however, was another kettle of fish. It was heavily defended by British military. They had over 100 soldiers in the barracks on that weekend, and it was heavily armoured. There was no way that the rebels were going to get in. Every time they launched an attack against the barracks, they were forced back. The British military immediately send messages to London informing them that there's been an uprising in Dublin City and likely that this is spread across the island. So the rebels do the only thing they can at this point. They bunker down and they prepare for whatever it is that Britain's going to throw at them, and they get ready and they set up shop everywhere. Now, everyone kind of believed that Britain would react quite harshly and that they would send huge numbers of ground troops, lots of footmen, into the city, and that it would be an urban battle fought to retake Dublin City. And it started out that way. The first 2 days of the conflict saw a lot of that. Troops firing at each other from one building to another. But Britain wanted this rebellion crushed as quickly as they could get it. So they sent the gunboat Helga up the River Liffey during the high tide, and she parked just beside O'Connell Bridge on the east side of the bridge. Now, the British officers in charge of the situation did request that the rebels, that there be peace and that they would arrest them and they'd be tried, and that would be it. There would be no more killing. The rebels at this point said, no, we've already committed to it, we're going to keep going. Upon hearing this news, the Helga opened fire onto O'Connell Street and devastated the north side of Dublin City. The GPO was all half destroyed, most of the building was on fire, huge numbers of buildings along O'Connell Street completely demolished. On top of that, the rebels took huge casualties, and there were even larger numbers of civilian casualties from this. The rebels quickly realised that they weren't going to be able to take on the ship, and soon after they surrendered. The majority of the leaders were rounded up, brought to Kilmainham prison, and the next day summarily executed. This was not a good idea. The people of Ireland reacted very, very badly to this. However, 2 important men managed to escape being arrested: Eamon de Valera and Michael Collins. De Valera fled to America, where he knew he would have support from the descendants of the Irish who moved to New York during the Irish famine in the 1840s. Whilst there, he raised lots and lots of money, the equivalent of millions of euro to this day, and he sent that money home to Michael Collins. Michael Collins had gone into hiding around Ireland, and he had regathered all of the Irish Republican Brotherhood and reformed them into the Irish Republican Army. And they began a new war to take back Ireland. The war relied very heavily on guerrilla-style tactics, and it turned out to be hugely successful. They focused mainly on very valuable assets that the British military and police had in Ireland. Now, Michael Collins also began a campaign of espionage in Ireland and Britain. He was able to infiltrate huge numbers of military barracks and police stations. This was down to the fact that before the Rising took place, Collins had a feeling that it might not go so well, so he destroyed every portrait of himself. This meant that the British intelligence had no way of identifying what he looked like, and there was no way the people of Ireland were going to hand him over. So 1918 comes around, and the end of the First World War. Britain has won the war, but at a huge cost to the nation. They're both financially and, militarily crippled. They're really, really struggling, and the war in Ireland is just costing more and more and more. And the British government realised that they cannot afford to keep up this war. So they offer peace, and they request talks with Michael Collins and members of the IRA. Michael Collins and his allies head over to London, where they begin the peace talks. They last for about a week and a half, and at the end of that, a deal is struck. And it essentially boils down to this. Of the 32 counties that make up the island of Ireland, 6 counties in Northern Ireland would become a separate state and would remain part of Great Britain. The reason for this is those 6 counties were predominantly Unionist and Protestant. They were very proud to be British. They didn't want to leave the Union. The other 26 counties would become a separate free state, and that would be that. Now, Michael Collins knew this was the best deal he was going to get at the time. He accepted it, signed the treaty, and left, returning to Ireland. Once back in Ireland, things didn't go as he anticipated. Almost immediately, the country breaks out in civil war. Half of Ireland feels that we hadn't achieved what we set out to get, that we essentially abandoned the 6 counties in Northern Ireland and the Catholics who lived there. The other half of the country feel, well, we've been fighting for this for over 800 years. It's time to take a break. We have most of the island. Let's see what we can do in the future. And civil war just runs rampant across the country. It becomes very unpleasant here in Ireland for a few years. But finally in 1922, the war comes to an end. And it comes to an end because Michael Collins, who is on his way down to Cork to engage in peace talks with the opposite side of the revolution, is assassinated. Now, the only people that know that he's heading down to Cork on this specific train are his closest allies, including Eamon de Valera. Nobody knows exactly who orchestrated Collins' assassination, but it is highly believed with historians in Ireland that it was Eamon de Valera who did this. With Michael Collins out of the way, the peace treaty is formed between the two sides. Eamon de Valera becomes the new leader of the Irish Free State. Now at this point, Ireland is, now we're crippled. We've no money, we're a poor farming nation, and we're very much struggling to get by. So what ends up happening is Eamon de Valera, who is a devout Catholic, invites the Roman Catholic Church into Ireland to essentially run all of the everyday services. So, schools, hospitals, all of these kind of things. And that is what manages to keep Ireland afloat at this time. Now, not much happens for a while. We then come forwards to the Second World War. And when the Second World War breaks out, Britain requests Ireland to fight in the war for them. And Ireland say no, we're not going to. So Germany asks Ireland, will you fight in the war? And Ireland says no, we're not going to fight for you either. Ireland decides to remain completely neutral throughout the war. Now, Irish neutrality is an unusual thing. We've tried to stay neutral in pretty much every situation that we can. But things in Ireland during the Second World War are actually quite okay. It's quite pleasant, and not a huge amount happens here. We don't really struggle for food. we do have food rationing, but it's not extreme or anything. But one quite interesting event does occur throughout the war here in Ireland. Whenever a pilot from either side of the war crash landed in Ireland, depending on where they were from, we would do something different with them. Now, if they were British, they were sent back to Britain. They were put in a boat and sent back to Britain. Nice and easy. German pilots, however, were kept here. And there were two things happened to the German pilots. They were either kept up on the Curragh in a base there in the Irish equivalent of a POW camp, or they were picked up by the police and brought to a local family down the country. That family would then be given money by the government to look after some of these pilots, and the pilots would receive some money as well. So what ended up happening is these pilots, would live with the families, they'd work the farms during the day, and in the evening they'd go to the pub with the man in the house. Wind of this got back to the German Air Force, and a lot of pilots realised, well, I can either stay fighting in the air and get shot at, or I could probably go and land in Ireland and get out of the war. The number of pilots crash landing in Ireland throughout the war begins to absolutely skyrocket. And it's great, people are managing to get out. There's incidents of planes landing, supposedly crash landing, but when the plane is found, it's in perfect condition. And the women of Ireland were delighted. It was literally raining men throughout the entire way of the war. Absolutely delighted with themselves. Now these pilots ended up settling down and marrying into the families and having kids, and because of this we actually have quite a large German-Irish population in Ireland. The end of the war comes around and they stay here. They like it so much. And to give you an idea of how strong of a kind of relationship we have because of this, there's a school in Dublin that's an all-German speaking school. So it is hugely successful in that sense. Then we get to the 1960s, and from 1960s up until the late 1990s is the period that we refer to here in Northern Ireland as the Troubles. Now, calling it the Troubles is a massive understatement, and it makes it seem like it was just, a few people who were a bit annoyed with each other. It wasn't. It was very much a civil war up here. Thousands of people were killed, hundreds more went missing and were never found again. So what exactly happened? After the Irish Free State had been formed, the IRA essentially went underground. They weren't that needed anymore. They fought their war. Ireland was now mostly free. But in the late 1960s, they began to come back out in force. Northern Ireland was having huge human rights issues, particularly towards the Catholic community of Northern Ireland. To give you an idea, during the worst times of unemployment in Northern Ireland, 17% of Protestant men were unemployed compared to the 68% of Catholic men. So huge disparities between the two. On top of this, there were general acts of violence being carried out, particularly towards the Roman Catholic community, and it was very unpleasant. Now, the IRA came out and began to fight to protect the Catholics, and they fought against another group in Northern Ireland called the UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force. Now, the UVF were also heavily associated with a group called the Orange Order, who are very much a legal organisation. They're still around today, and these are all groups of Protestants that, have, it's just a community really. Now, initially the war starts out with the IRA and the UVF killing off each other's members and assassinating one another. However, it's not long before the war begins to devolve into a very, very dirty war. It goes from assassinating each other's members to assassinating people of the opposite religion to just general indiscriminate bombing campaigns. The most bombed hotel in the world is in Belfast City. It's the Europa Hotel. I'll show it to you when we're going by. I hear that they have quite nice airy rooms. But things were really rough up here. It was not a good place to be for a very long time. And a lot of people around the world came out in protest of what was happening. There's the very famous song Zombie by, does everybody know the band The Cranberries? Yeah, they wrote the song Cranberry, Dolores O'Riordan, the lead singer of The Cranberries. When Dolores O'Riordan died a number of years ago, she took her own life, and she wrote a farewell letter to the people of Ireland, pretty much. And in it, she mentions how the conflict of Northern Ireland had such a negative effect on her mental health, combined with other issues that she'd been having, that she deemed it as one of the substantial reasons that she ended up taking her life. And it was a very, very sad time. We had a long period of mourning here when that happened. So, in the 1970s and 80s, the Prime Minister of Great Britain was a woman named Margaret Thatcher. Have you heard of Margaret Thatcher, guys? Yeah? Yeah. She was a very disliked woman in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England. She wasn't liked in the UK because she refused to give in to any of the requests or demands of the coal miners in Britain at the time. She was the head of the Tory party, they're the Conservative Party in Britain. And over here, it was because of what happened in Northern Ireland. I'll get into that now in 1 second, but to give you an idea of how much she was disliked here, the day that she died, the #1 song played on the radio in Ireland was Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead. Okay, so that gives you an idea. Now, it was also the most requested song in Britain, but the BBC refused to play it as a mark of respect to her and her family. So, why was she so disliked in Ireland? Well, throughout her term in office, she refused to acknowledge anybody fighting in Northern Ireland as anything other than a terrorist. A lot of the people who were being interned in prison for crimes in relation to the conflict, they were just deemed as terrorists, particularly on the Republican side. Now, there was one man in particular, Bobby Sands. He and a number of inmates in a prison up in Northern Ireland called the H-Blocks decided to go on a hunger strike. Now, as part of their protest, they went on hunger strike, but as well as this, they went in and engaged in what's called a dirty protest. A dirty protest is essentially where they smeared their own fecal matter all over the walls of their prison cells to make it as inhospitable as possible. It attracted a huge amount of global media attention. Lots and lots of reporters came to interview the inmates, and Bobby Sands around this time was going through a parliamentary election, and Bobby Sands was elected into Westminster in London. However, because he was still locked in prison, he never ever got to sit at his seat in Westminster because he ended up dying during his hunger strike. These men's, sacrifices, there were 10 of them who died in total. Their sacrifice was hugely important and marked a massive turning point in Northern Ireland. People from all over the world were absolutely furious at what was happening up here. And finally, in 1998, a man named John Hume arrived on the scene. And John Hume was hugely important because he was the man who orchestrated what's called the Good Friday Agreement, which is still in effect to this day. The Good Friday Agreement essentially was this. In return for the different paramilitary groups laying down their weapons and disbanding and ending the war, everyone in Northern Ireland would be entitled to both a British and an Irish passport, because up until this point you could only have a British one. The border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland would, for all intents and purposes, be removed. As you saw when we came up, you basically wouldn't notice it's there. And in addition to this, anybody interned in prison for a crime in relation to the war would have their sentence drastically slashed. So they would essentially get out almost immediately. And it was agreed upon. And it was absolutely incredible when it happened. John Hume was given the Nobel Peace Prize because he was the first man in Ireland, or the first man in history, to ever form any kind of calmness and peace up here in Northern Ireland. Now, for my family, it was a very important time. I was only 5 years old when it took place, but I will never forget seeing my parents standing in front of the TV, hugging and crying, because I'm with my family. Sorry. With my family, my mother's side of the family hail from Scotland. They're very proud to be British. They're heavily unionist. They really support the Crown. My father's side of the family, they are Republican, and very, very, very Republican. My great-grandfather on my father's side was Eamon de Valera's personal bodyguard. When my grandparents on my dad's side died, we renovated the house, we opened up some of the walls, and we found 19 rifles hidden in the walls dating back to the 1916 Rising. Now, we handed them in to the National History Museum in Dublin, and they're now on display there. But when my parents were married in 1992, the only members of their families that went to the wedding were two of my dad's four brothers and my mum's brother and sister. None of their parents, aunties, uncles, grandparents, none of them showed up to the wedding. It was considered so unacceptable back then. But things are changing, and it's getting better. With the peace achieved in Northern Ireland, things start to become more pleasant in the north. More money is pumped into their economy. They have huge investment from all over the world coming in, and it's an absolutely wonderful place to visit now. And they have so much for people to see. Things were pretty good up here, and they still are, but we have a little bit more tension now, because a few years ago Britain voted to leave Europe, or as it's called, Brexit. You've all heard of Brexit, yeah? Yeah, Brexit, depending whatever your attitude towards Brexit is, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, in Ireland it's considered a very, very bad thing, because Brexit has the potential to reignite the war here in Northern Ireland. Essentially, if Brexit had gone through the way that Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson wanted it to, Britain would have pulled out of Europe entirely, which means that a new border would have had to be put up between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. When this was being discussed initially before the vote, the IRA came out saying, do not interfere with the border. It took us a long time. If you interfere with the Good Friday Agreement at all, the war will start again. And the UVF came out saying the same thing. Brexit went ahead, and 2.5 weeks after the vote was, counted, a bomb went off outside of Derry. This bomb had been placed along the training grounds of the Northern Irish Police Force. It was detonated about 400 metres in front of them. Now, no one really knew whether or not things were that serious, if people were going to come out and fight, but this was a very clear warning and message: don't interfere. To deal with the border crisis of Northern Ireland, the proposal that was put through was to put a theoretical customs border in the middle of the Irish Sea around Northern Ireland and the Republic. It is a temporary solution. We don't know how things are going to change. One of the reasons that Brexit is taking so long to get through is down to the fact that, Northern Ireland is causing all these delays. Boris Johnson has made numerous statements and comments about how he, for all intents and purposes, really doesn't care about Northern Ireland. And it shows a huge level of ignorance that he has spoken about parts of the Good Friday Agreement that are just completely untrue. A lot of people in Northern Ireland are very, very angry about this, especially the Unionists, because they feel very abandoned up here. 8 weeks ago, Northern Ireland had its parliamentary elections for Stormont, which is the Northern Ireland Government Building, and for the first time in Northern Ireland's history, the political party associated with the IRA, called Sinn Féin, won the majority seats. They won the most seats of any party in Northern Ireland. This is huge. This means that Unionists voted for the Republican Party. This has never really happened before. It's a big, big deal. It shows a huge lack of faith from the Unionists and the current British government. So, who knows what's going to happen? If you had said to me 5 or 6 years ago, would I ever see a united Ireland? I would have said, in my lifetime, probably not. Now, who knows? We could only be 10 years away before this. Because there is a possibility of a vote being triggered in Northern Ireland to see whether or not the people want to leave Britain and join Ireland or stay. I think it's definitely a possibility of it happening. Now, whether or not I think it's a good idea, well, I would like to see United Ireland, but I don't know if Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland are ready for it. The wounds are still very fresh in a lot of people's minds. It's still a very delicate situation, and there are still plenty of people still around who want to remain part of the Union. So what's going to happen here in the next few years? It's completely impossible to tell, really. So that's kind of where Northern Ireland is at the moment. Now, they're doing really well in general. The country is doing very well for itself financially. They're doing well. The tourism sector is still booming. So things are good, and they are really good fun to go out with, actually. Belfast City is a fantastic city, and there's a lot to do. The nightlife in the city is absolutely amazing, guys. It's really, really good. But that's pretty much where we're at today. The Republic of Ireland is doing quite well. We were the first country in the world to democratically vote in gay marriage. That was a huge event back in 2015. And yeah, we're doing generally very well. So the only real issue we have at the moment is the Brexit issue, but who knows what's going to happen with that. So that's it, guys. We're going to make our way towards Belfast now. We're not too far out. Sit back and relax, just enjoy yourselves, and we'll be there soon enough, guys. Do you have any questions?